To everybody here in the classroom and out in Zoom land. My name's Tom Glover, and I'm going to be the coordinator for today's HASS class, Early Railroads in Michigan. Presenting the class will be HASS member Paul Trapp, who is retired from a 28-year career as a teacher in the Grand Haven Public School system. Paul holds a BA and an MA, as well as a specialist in arts degree all from Western Michigan University. During most of his time at the Grand Haven schools, Mr. Trapp taught history, but he also taught third grade and served as a special ed teacher with Grand Haven schools. Plus, he has served as an adjunct professor of history at Grand Valley State University. And rounding out his career, he's been employed by the National Park Service as a park ranger. Paul has enjoyed a lifetime interest in railroad history. He is a member of several national railroad history organizations and is on the organizing committee of the Michigan Railroad History Conference. Paul has a son in Utah, a daughter in Georgia, and one grandchild, that's his grandson who lives in North Carolina. Paul has asked that we hold our questions until the end of his formal presentation, and we'll announce the Q&A time when that's appropriate. So with that, I'll turn the microphone and camera over to Paul Trapp to add to our knowledge of early railroads in Michigan.
Warm introduction. Okay. I appreciate the warm introduction and the applause. I hope you feel the same way in an hour and a half. I want to make it clear I'm not a railroad modeler. I'm involved in railroad history, and we're going to talk today about an economic history of Michigan's first railroads. Now, if economics is a dismal science, railroads are simply the dismal science on steel wheels. And we're going to talk a very limited time period from the start of railroading in Michigan in 1830 to the start of the Civil War. Railroad work stopped in Michigan at the start of the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, it becomes very complicated. So we're going to just do the easy part. That's easier for me. Got to see which direction it goes. Okay, Michigan is the most recognizable of all the states. Every kid knows the mitten. But because Michigan is a peninsula or two peninsulas, Michigan is very hard to get to. And to make matters worse, besides coming over the water or coming from an enemy nation, Great Britain, people had trouble getting to Michigan. And to make it worse, there was a big black swamp here, so that it is very difficult to come up into the state. So Michigan was a latecomer. Other states grew, gained population, gained statehood before Michigan. As a matter of fact, when Ohio became a state, Michigan had only 3,000 people in the whole territory. Michigan did not become a state until 1837. Things became easier in 1918 with the coming of the first steamboat, named appropriately Walk on the Water. That made it easier to come from Buffalo to Detroit without having to make that long, laborious path. Then in 1825, things got much better with the development of the Erie Canal across New York. So people could come from New York, across the state on the canal, get on a steamboat, and come across the lake. we can see the difference with the population. In 1810, we had 5,000 people. With the steamboat, it jumped to almost double, 9,000 people. With a canal, in 5 years, we're up to 32,000. And in 1840, we had 200,000 people. So you can see the growth that came from improved transportation. But when you have more people, you have a demand for more services. Services not only to move the people, but move the products of the people. And that became a real call for better transportation. So we'll look at why the railroads were built. We'll look a little bit at who was involved and where the money came from. Making railroads is like making sausage. You like what happens, but you don't like the process. Then we'll talk about how they were built. First of all, you got to have a legal basis to build. You have to have a charter. You need money. And the process of getting that money, as we say, was difficult. The problems of actually building construction. We don't think of Michigan as a hard place to build a railroad. We look at the building the railroad over the Sierra Nevadas and the Rocky Mountains and think, oh, Michigan was a breeze, but we did have our construction problems. And then we'll talk about what happened, the operation, a little bit of evolution, change in ownership. And then the most important question for a historian, so what? Did the railroads make any difference? Let's get a little historical context. We mentioned the walk in the water of the Erie Canal. 1837, Michigan became a state and immediately organized an internal improvements program. And we'll talk about that. And that was done just in time for the Panic of 1837. And the first of our major economic crisis. Then we have some European issues. In 1845 was the Irish potato famine. Irish, like the Dutch, the food of the poor were potatoes. The good land was owned by British landowners, and they grew corn there. Now remember, corn is what we call corn is maize. What the British called corn was wheat and rye. Corn simply means the most common grain of a country. So if you go back in the Old Testament and talk about the Pharaoh finding the sack of Benjamin's cup and the sack of corn, it was really wheat. Okay, so the Irish potato famine. And what happened was that the food that was grown in Ireland, the wheat, was all shipped to England because they could make more money getting it from the English people and allowed the Irish people to starve to death. There became a huge cry and pressure on Parliament, and they passed what were called the Corn Laws, or they repealed the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws protected the landowners' market. Those laws were repealed, and when they were repealed, there was a great demand for American wheat. Further, in 1854, there was a war, the Crimean War, started over who was going to control the holy place, which Christian church was going to control the holy places in Jerusalem. But wars mean armies, armies need food, and there was another great demand for American wheat. 1856, Congress started providing land grants just as the end of the Crimean War. So we have a boom. In 1856 starts a crisis. 1857, we have a panic, and that really slows up any kind of railroad production, and it stops in 1860. So we got the background. The first railroad to be built in Michigan the first railroad to be built in Michigan, not the first railroad to be chartered, but the first one to be actually built was the Erie and Kalamazoo. Starting here at the town of Port Lawrence and continuing to the first spot where they could reach the Kalamazoo River. Then thinking that you could carry goods on the Kalamazoo River from Saugatuck to the river point by Adrian. Let me get my notes. Okay, this railroad was started by Darius and the Addison Comstock. Now, these were two guys who were builders. They had been working, constructing the Erie Canal. As a matter of fact, if you've been to Lockport at the very end of the western end of the Erie Canal, those two guys built it. They were builders. But after the construction of the Erie Canal, they moved to Michigan and started the community of Adrian. Now, their need was to bring goods from Port Lawrence, later called Toledo. And we had a war over that, but that's a different story. So they wanted to bring goods from the port at Toledo to Adrian. So they got a charter from the Michigan Territorial Legislature and built that railroad. So make it clear, they had a very clear purpose for that railroad. They had a clear program and they were skilled builders. To get the money, they got it from the local people, from themselves and from other local people. While very few people in Michigan at that time had sufficient cash to buy stock in railroads. So what the railroads did is go to the legislature and got a charter for a bank. So the people could turn their hard money into the bank, their little bits and pieces, which begins to accumulate. Then the banks can start to borrow on that to print paper money based on that money. And then as they begin building the railroad becomes collateral to make more paper money. So the bank provides the funding. It was a horse-drawn railroad. And if you look, you can see the efficiency of a railroad, even if it's drawn by horses. So the first year of operation was a horse-drawn railroad. But on a dry road, a horse can pull 3 times its own weight. When it's on rails, it can pull 54 times its own weight. So you have a substantial advantage in transportation power. This is a picture of the first steam railroad in Michigan. As a matter of fact, in 1837, the Comstocks bought a locomotive from Baldwin Locomotive Works. It was shipped here in pieces. It was assembled and put to work. It was a great idea, but the economics were terrible. They made money as a horse-drawn railroad. But once they had the locomotive, of course, they had to pay for the locomotive. They had to pay a staff to run the locomotive, but also they had to rebuild the railroad. They had to put a metal strap on the railroad because the weight of the locomotive was too heavy for the wooden rails that they had used before. This was the first locomotive to be brought anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains. It was here. And this is the first picture of a Michigan railroad and the passenger car. I think that's a little bit overdrawn. The first passenger car probably looked more like this. This drawing comes from the Transportation Library at the University of Michigan. And I think it's far more accurate than the other one. Now, I am sure that everybody wanted to get in the top of the train so they got the best view when they traveled. And after the train stopped, all they wanted was a lower. I mean, these were rough rails, and you can imagine, you're getting seasick on a train. Well, with the coming of the locomotives, it was more than the Comstocks could pay. So they sold the railroad to George Bliss, who was an Eastern financier. He was the money guy. So he owned the Erie and Kalamazoo Railroad. He leased it to another railroad that he owned. And we'll talk about that lease in time. So a quick run through the Erie and Kalamazoo. It was started in 1834. It was organized, constructed in 1836, first locomotive in 1847, then leased to the Michigan Southern Railroad for 999 years. It didn't quite make it. But every year, think, Bliss paid $60,000 for the railroad. But every year, he got $30,000 in rent for that railroad and collected until 1970. Oh, I wish I could find an investment like that. The railroad is still operating today. It's the oldest continuously operating railroad in the Midwest. It's basically the Adrian and Blissfield is the old Erie and Kalamazoo. It's basically a tourist line. The Southern Michigan Railroad does tourist service, but they also haul coal. Okay. The population of Michigan was concentrated in Detroit. It was hard to get anyplace else. It was hard to get people to come to Michigan. But some promoters in Detroit decided that they would look for a place to start a new community. Searching around, moving north, they found an opening where Pontiac is now located. They platted a city, and in 1821, came in 1818, 1821, Pontiac consisted of 6 houses, 1 grist mill, 1 sawmill. Now, most of the people living in the area surrounding Pontiac were farmers. They grew corn. But it was very expensive to move the corn from Pontiac to Detroit where it could be put on the ships. So they tried to convert it into a more valuable product. So what do you make out of corn to make it more valuable? You distill it, you turn it into whiskey. The problem is the residents sampled too much of their work. So the promoters of the town sought to get a railroad. So they received a charter. That's the second charter. The first charter they received in 1830 was for the Pontiac and Detroit Railroad. The problem was it was a lousy charter. The charter allowed them to build a railroad, but did not give them the right of eminent domain. So they could not force their way through any territory. They had to, then, after 14 years, they had to give the railroad to the state. And the state would give them their tolls, would set the tolls. So you just couldn't make any money on it. Nothing happened with it. But it is important to note, this was 1830. The first major railroad in the world was built in 1829 with the Rain Hill trials, where Stephenson rocket proved that a steam locomotive was practical. This charter was written just 9 months later, and specifically it said they could use steam power. That's a fantastic transmission of technology, particularly in that time. But the charter was no good. So if you're a land promoter who's crazy enough to build a new community out in the wilderness, are you going to allow just a charter to stop you? No, you take what money you've got and you go to the legislature and you buy a new charter. Buying congressmen and representatives, even worked in a territorial government. So in 1834, they bought a charter for the Detroit and Pontiac Railroad. It gave more power to the company. It had the right of eminent domain. If they took your land, they had to pay for it. But if you don't have eminent domain, you can't build a railroad, because one person in the way keeps you from completing the whole line. So you have to have the right to take land for the common good. The right of eminent domain. We do it all the time with highways. Sometimes that power is abused, but the government has that power and can transfer it to a private corporation. They got the charter. And again, the problem of money. So they also got a charter to start a bank. Now, the founders of the company wanted to find somebody to take over the operation. So they found a guy by the name of Sherman Stevens, who was a banker in Buffalo. When he heard about the railroad, but more importantly, when he heard about the bank, he wanted to get involved. There's a number of ways a bank could make money. One thing to remember at those days, each bank made its own money. So if you lived in New York and came to Michigan, and you had a bank from Oneonta, New York, nobody in Michigan is going to take that paper. So you change it at the bank for a fee, and then you get Michigan money to do business in Michigan. So the conversion of money helps you to make a lot of cash. Kind of like the story of the money changers in the temple. But also, when people deposited money, you could print paper money. So Sherman Stevens and a partner, come on, dummy. Names are a problem. But Sherman and Stevens and his partner each put in $5,000, took over the bank, took Alfred Williams, the founder of Owasso, and a fur trader with the American Fur Company. When they took over, they started taking in, well, they opened an office, they painted a black box to look like a safe, and started taking people's money and started printing paper money. And did they print paper money? As a matter of fact, in 1837, with that panic of 1837, the bank went bankrupt, and they found out then that they had taken in $3,000 in deposits and printed somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000 in paper money. Of course, everybody who held that paper money was out of luck. The survey for the railroad was done by John Berrien. Berrien County, Berrien Springs. Berrien was an officer in the United States Army. The only engineering school in the United States at that time was West Point. So Berrien was assigned to come, and the Army wanted people, their officers, to go out and work on these railroad projects. One, it was community service, but it was practical experience for the soldiers. There are rumors that Robert E. Lee was part of Berrien's company, but I have never been able to confirm that. So he was the provider, and the people in Michigan did not have any trouble getting the United States Army to come and survey their projects, because Lewis Cass, former Michigan governor, senator of Michigan, from Michigan, and was the Secretary of War for Andrew Jackson. So as a Secretary of War, he sent a lot of projects back to Michigan. It's good to have somebody on your side. Construction, as I say, was difficult. The problem with Michigan is we were part of that glacier period over the ice ages. And as each glacier retreated, a glacier would come in, push all kinds of dirt as it advanced forward, but then when it retreated, it would leave that pile of dirt. And then there would be a gully, and then when the glacier came forward and retreated again, it would leave a whole series of terminal moraines. Now, in between those moraines, it would collect moisture and dirt, and over time, dirt would be built over a very wet area. It was a bog. So there was a thin layer of land that was held together. But once you cut that, you broke the tension of the land. So the people on the building the Pontiac Railroad hit that first bog and cut a trench, thinking they would build two drainages, and piled the dirt in the center to hold the rails. They came by, and the next morning, then they had a canal. The weight of that extra water pushed it down, and you just had a drench. So for much of Michigan's railroad construction, it was a problem of finding the fill or building trestles to get through these wet spots. But they built. Sherman Stevens, promoter. First thing he did after getting the charter was got a new charter to start the community of Royal Oak. Where's the first stop on the railroad going to be? But he built a sawmill. Now, he went into the woods along the right-of-way and cut the logs. Some of the larger logs he just laid on the ground, and that became the base, and then brought the others to the sawmill and cut the ties. Then sold the ties to the railroad. So the railroad paid him to cut the trees down, paid him to haul the trees away. He cut up the trees and sold it back to the railroad as ties. Now, a railroad would be built by putting the wooden plank down, usually about 6 by 7. And then that wood rail would be held in place by wedges. And that's the way you could adjust the width of the rail a little bit. And then with the introduction of steam locomotives, you had to put a steel plate on the top. And one of the problems was that if you kept running over this rail, it created new stresses. You've all, when you're bored in school, take a little strip of paper and ran your finger over it, and it started to curl. Well, that would happen on these rails. They would curl up and through the bottom of the car. On the Detroit and Pontiac, nobody died, but one woman was hit right smack in the chest. And it's a good thing that's where she was holding her purse, because that saved her life. Snakeheads. So the railroad is constructed. Sherman Stevens went to Baldwin, had a locomotive sent. Baldwin even sent an engineer, Benjamin Briscoe, to help assemble it and help to run it. Sherman Stevens got a big brass plate, and you can see what he named the locomotive. One little problem: he didn't pay for it. Finally, Baldwin hauled him into court after 5 years and was forced to settle for half of the amount that Stevens had promised to pay him. In 1842, the railroad took 9 years to build from Detroit to Pontiac. 1842, the railroad was operational. Now we can see what equipment they had. The rolling stock, they had 2 passenger cars. They had an 8-wheeled rack, basically a flat car, 3 covered freight cars, and then 5 smaller flat cars and 2 log cars. The locomotive equipment included 1 locomotive, the Sherman Stevens, a gray horse, a white horse, a mouse-colored horse, and a black horse. Those were the switch engines. The Austria, no. This railroad was a joke. Called a fun maker. All kinds of crazy stories. How come there are no prisoners in the penitentiary in Pontiac? They sentenced them in the court in Detroit, and by the time they got to Pontiac, their sentence had been fulfilled. This young couple got married in Detroit, and by the time they got to Pontiac, they were suffering from old age. The train would go through, and anybody who wanted to see the train would wave, and the train would stop. Whether you had some business, whether you wanted to get on the train, or just wanted to ask the engineer or the passengers, what's going on in Detroit now? But even so, the railroad was really of great benefit. It used to take 2 days on Michigan roads to go to get to Pontiac. It took 2 hours on the train when the train ran right. Now, if it was raining and the rails were a little slippery and it was a little more difficult for the train to run, you came to a hill, the passengers would be asked to get off and push. So Detroit and Pontiac Railroad, we're going to leave it for a little while, but again, in 1830, the Pontiac in Detroit, 34, the new railroad was chartered. 1835, the Bank of Pontiac. 36, Royal Oak was started in the sawmill. 38, service began to Royal Oak, to Birmingham in 39, and completed to Pontiac in the early 1830s. We'll come back to the railroad and we'll talk about these Michigan Central people providing funding to upgrade the railroad. In 1837, Michigan became a state. The first governor was Stevens T. Mason, the boy governor. He became the acting governor of the territory of Michigan at the ripe old age of 17. He was later named to be the territorial governor and then removed by Andrew Jackson because Stevens pushed an effort to make Michigan a state. And he was successful. In 1835, Michigan passed a constitution creating a state government. Unfortunately, before you can really be an effective government, you had to be approved by Congress. And Ohio didn't like it. Ohio has always been a problem for us. And Ohio had a real issue, an important issue. We laugh about it. The people in Michigan were furious about it, but there was a reality. Ohio had invested in a huge series of canals. And most of those canals emptied into the Maumee River and Toledo. But by the early maps, Toledo was north of the border. So there was a fight over where that border should be moved. Soldiers moved, militias moved back and forth. Fortunately, there was only one casualty. Oh, we got time to talk about him. The guy was, the only casualty in the war was I'm drawing a blank on his name. Anyway, his father was the Indian agent, expecting to have many children, many boys. So his first son, he just called one. Called the second one, two. And that's all he had. But he had to come up with names for the 7 girls. Anyway, 2 was the only casualty. He got stabbed. He healed. But it was a bitter fight. But Ohio had congressmen. They had senators. Michigan didn't have a chance. So we made a terrible bargain to give up Port Lawrence, which they then called Toledo. We got the western half of the Upper Peninsula. It seemed like a good idea to get that, particularly when they discovered copper and iron and timber. So Michigan became a state. And when Michigan became a state, the Constitution of the state said the legislature must establish an internal improvements program. We have to develop transportation. So they came up with 2 canals, the Kalamazoo and Clinton Canal. Oh, they probably created maybe 50 feet of that. And then there was the Saginaw Canal, which was to connect to the Grand River. And then they planned to build 3 railroads. A southern railroad along the southern border, a central railroad, and then the northern railroad. These were all supposed to be state operations. But if you recall, the Detroit and Pontiac Railroad had already been built The Erie and Kalamazoo had been built, and the state ended up buying that railroad, but chartering that railroad. But then the Northern Railroad was not built by the state, but these two railroads were started by the state, the Northern Railroad by a private corporation. To build this major internal improvements program, the state legislature authorized Sherman Stevens to sell $5 million in bonds. Remember 1837? There's a panic going on. He sent people east to buy the bonds. The banks would not touch them. He sent people to London. That's where the money was. People wouldn't touch them. But he finally got a New Jersey company to buy the bonds. This company was the Morris Canal and Banking Company. The canal was built to carry goods, coal, from Western Pennsylvania over the mountain to the coast. Morris Canal and Banking Company says, we will buy your bonds. We will take them and we will give you $500,000 a year for the next 10 years. They took the bonds and they sold them, promising to pay Michigan. But in the meantime, that canal proved to be a rather lousy investment. Now think if you start moving coal and to come up over a mountain and bring it down, you had to build a series of locks and trackways. It was 102 miles long. It had a rise and fall of 1,600 feet, 700 feet up, 900 feet down. It took 23 locks and 23 inclined planes. You're just not going to make money. But to cover their losses, they absorbed the Michigan bonds. So Michigan didn't get the money. They got some, but not all of it. So Michigan was broke. People were frustrated. They threw Sherman Stevens out of office. We had two governors who tried to build that internal improvement program. Finally, our fourth governor, John Barry, said, number one, we're not going to pay for the money for the bonds that we didn't get the money for. That shot Michigan's credit right down the drain. I mean, the people who bought the bonds thinking they bought them in good faith were left without. John Barry also determined the state is never going to be able to finish those lines. We better sell it. So he worked with the legislature, got the legislature to agree to sell the railroads. The idea for the canal had died. So during the state period, the state had built the Michigan Central Railroad as far as Kalamazoo. That's how the Hollanders got to Holland. They came from Detroit to Kalamazoo, then to Allegan, and then by wagon to Michigan. And then they had built the Central line up to Hillsdale. So they're looking for a buyer. They contacted a Detroit attorney who was involved in this whole legislative process, James Joy. Became the railroad king. He was a real railroad promoter in Michigan, the Illinois Central, the Burlington route, and he was very successful because he had friends. As a matter of fact, he did a lot of business with the attorney for the Illinois Central Railroad. They had a very close relationship. There was some guy, what the heck was his name? A. Lincoln? Anyway, Joy went out and had to find some money to buy these railroads. To get money, you start looking at the local people. If you don't have enough, you look at the people in the state. Then you go to the banking business on the East Coast. Kind of like dropping a stone in a pond and you see the ripples. You try the first ripple. If that doesn't work, you got the second, the third. So we went out east. The first person he contacted was Erastus Corning. Corning was a manufacturer. He had the first open hearth furnaces in America. Corning was starting to make rails. He thought the railroads would do two things. One, they would be consumers of his rails. And secondly, it would make it possible to ship the rails and his other iron products. So he was interested in developing railroads. And he was willing to put some money in. He had been involved with the Detroit and Pontiac Railroad. We'll come back to that, as I said. And he had been involved in Michigan. He's the guy who financed the St. Mary's Ship Canal, the one we call the Sioux Locks, and building them with a guy by the name of John Brooks. He had another investor, John Murray Forbes. Now, Corning was from New York, Forbes was from Boston. His family had been involved in the China trade, and they made a fortune. Now, remember what the China trade really was. You went to China to exchange American goods for Chinese goods and bring them back. The problem was we wanted Chinese porcelains, Chinese spices, but they didn't want anything we made. They considered themselves to be too sophisticated. Their stuff was too good. So what do? You get something that they will buy. Opium from India. Murray Forbes and most China traders were really drug dealers. And they made a lot of money. He came in back home in his early 20s and began investing in land, making more money, and was willing to invest in railroads. The third partner in that operation was an engineer. He didn't have money, but he had skill. He's a guy who worked with Corning in building the St. Mary's Ship Canal. He was a builder, a natural engineer. He was efficient, but he was bullheaded. You had to do it Brooks' way, and that created serious problems. So the Michigan Central Railroad, as you can see, was supposed to have been built from Detroit to St. Joseph, to the mouth of the St. Joseph River. But as they began to survey it and survey the line, the proposal, you can see the state line, the surveyed line, they didn't like the mouth of the St. Joseph River because it was too swampy. So they went to the legislature and leaned and dropped some things off to the legislature and got them to change the route to New Buffalo. And they began the construction and built it fairly quickly to New Buffalo. And then from New Buffalo, it was their intention to run by ships across the lake. As a matter of fact, they were going to use the ships of Eber Ward, the same guy who had supported Van Raalte the first winter when he was in Detroit. Van Raalte's people got to Detroit in the fall as the lakes were freezing, and Ward said, "I'll give your people work in a shipyard and a place to stay and a camp out in a warehouse." The same guy who was going to run the ships across the lake. So the canal was built, and they thought that the money that they had put into the Detroit and Pontiac Railroad would be a feeder line to this one. There was a problem. When the state ran the railroad, it was not in very good shape. When Brooks built the railroad, it was in great shape. The trains were able to run on iron rails. They could run at night. They ran faster. And I'm missing a slide. Anyway, the railroads ran through the countryside and people practiced open field raising cattle. You just let the cattle roam and find their own food. And unfortunately, the cattle found it easier to walk on the rail line than walk on through the muck. And the railroad, when it was run by the state, ran slow. You could get the cows off the track. There weren't many killed. And when one cow was killed by a state railroad, the state paid the farmer for the cow. When the trains started running with the Michigan Central Railroad, they ran faster and killed a lot of cows. Brooks said, "You farmers, you should put up fences to keep your cows off the tracks." And the farmer said, "We were here first. You should put up the fences. And if you don't put up the fences, you should pay for the cows." Nothing was done. Cows were killed. Particularly, it was a problem around Jackson where there was a lot of swampy land. So the farmers began to revolt. They would take the dead cows and rub them along the tracks so the tracks were slippery and stop the train. They would pile logs on the track. They would shoot at the trains. And there's a lot of anger. And we know how politicians or people who are involved or feel abused can argue. They started talking about, let's get even with the railroad. Brooks sent out a group of spies to listen to the people and keep track of who was complaining. Then Detroit had built up a big facility. This is a picture of the early Detroit rail yard. And the depot burned. And when it burned, Brooks when the depot burned, Brooks had the people who he thought were involved arrested in a grand action. Posses were formed and they just swooped down and they arrested 46 people. including the ringleader, Abel Fitch. Now, most of these guys had just sat around in bars and talked about getting even with the railroad. But they were arrested, they were brought to Detroit and charged in Detroit rather than in the counties where they had been living and where the complaints against them. The railroad controlled the newspapers in the state. So they could write the stories making out that these guys were real villains. The railroad hired every attorney in the state. So the defendants could not find an attorney. They passed a law in the legislature that the defendants could not testify in their own defense. They got railroaded. Finally, Abel Fitch and the defendants were able to find an attorney, a guy by the name of William Seward. Seward later became and very soon afterwards, became the running for the nomination for the Republican nomination for the president and lost to Lincoln. What was the old ditty? Seward is a gentleman, Lincoln is an ass. Tried to present Lincoln. Well, anyway, Seward later was added to the cabinet. And he thought he was going to run the country as Secretary of State. It became very clear who was running the country. And Seward became an important supporter of Lincoln as Secretary of State, carried us through the Civil War. Of course, in the Seward's Folly, that little piece of land, Alaska, that we bought. But he came and defended the people. And his position was impossible. Most of the testimony came from a guy by the name of George Gay. Unfortunately, George Gay died. He wrote the affidavits, made affidavits, and then died. So he could not be cross-examined. People thought about, well, we'll cross-examine his wife and she can tell what, and then they realized that George Gay's business was running a bordello. And if the widow had been brought to the stand, she might talk about the clientele. Fitch died in jail waiting for trial. And over time, the people turned from vicious criminals to martyrs. Now, 12 people were convicted. But within just a couple of years, they were pardoned or their sentences were commuted. Oh, I'm running out of time. I talk too much. Oop, we're going the wrong direction too. Now, the Michigan Central Railroad was completed by a company that was efficient, operational, but Michigan had another railroad, this southern line that went to Hillsdale with a branch going up to Jackson. They wanted to get rid of that one too, but they couldn't find a buyer. Finally, they found three brothers, the Litchfields, Elisha, Electus, and Edwin. They agreed to buy, but they couldn't come up with the money. Took a long time. And they had a deadline. The state extended the deadline. The state cut the price. One thing the state did not want was to get that railroad back. Finally, they convinced George Bliss to take over. He's the guy who had also taken over the Erie and Kalamazoo, if you remember. George Bliss had Western money, or Eastern money. So we talked about the Erie and Kalamazoo, and it was sold, and we talked about that deal, the $30,000 rent for every year. So the Southern people had a real problem. This dotted line is a chart that they were, is where the railroad was surveyed by the state. But the state allowed the Michigan Central to come down and open their port at New Buffalo. The problem was the charter for the Michigan Southern said that they could not build within 5 miles of the Michigan Central. And it was impossible to get out of the state or get to the water. So finally, the state legislature offered them that they could build into Indiana after they got to Constantine, because that's where an important legislator lived. So they built the line to White Pigeon, built a branch to Constantine, and then started going on into Indiana. Now, as they came into Indiana, it appeared that their primary goal was to get in that place called Chicago. That's where all the Western railroads were starting to congregate. The Michigan Central Railroad had planned to use ships across Lake Erie and then across Lake Michigan. We mentioned that before, using Eber Ward ships. So the Michigan Central Railroad was offered the opportunity to buy a railroad through Indiana and turned it down for $50,000. The Michigan Southern bought it and began building their line into Chicago. They got to Chicago, and then to get to the depot, they ran on the Rock Island Railroad. Suddenly, Michigan Central realized that they had a problem and began to build their own line to Chicago. Instead of the $50,000 they would have bought for this line, they had to pay $500,000 to build here. Now, they built their line to Kensington. If you've taken the South Shore, you hear the word Kensington. That's where the South Shore connects to the Illinois Central. The Michigan Central at that time then also connected at that place at Kensington, connected to the Illinois Central Railroad, and then took the Illinois Central along the lake shore into Chicago. Now, there was a little problem at the Grand Junction. The Michigan Southern and Northern Indiana reconfigured had a line across here. The Illinois Central, the Michigan Southern said, you've got to build over. You cannot cross at grade level. You got to build a bridge over. So John Brooks, not being a guy to fool around, hired some thugs, and then as soon as it was dark, they seized the Michigan Southern Guards, held them down, and built the line across. In the morning, it was there. There was a diamond. But both railroads claimed that they had priority. And it really worked for 3 years. And then a Michigan Southern immigrant train was coming this way when a Michigan Central freight was coming this way. They collided and killed 18 people. After that, both companies stopped and checked to make sure that the crossing was clear. Part of the debate became which of the two railroads got into Chicago first. It was good PR. Michigan Southern really got into Chicago first, but they had this gap here. And Michigan, that was in May, and then later in June, the Michigan Central got in. It got in all the way. But the truth is, neither of them got into Chicago. The Michigan Southern needed the Rock Island, and the Michigan Central needed the Illinois Central. So they were operating. Now we come to the Michigan Southern, and then Michigan Southern and Northern Indiana ran the line to Toledo. And from Toledo, there was a whole lot of little railroads. So it was easier to run a steamboat than it was to cross on the line, run a steamboat from Toledo to Buffalo rather than going by land. But over time, those were all connected, and it became one rail line, the Lakeshore Line. So the railroad changed its name again to the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern as it was built across. Now, the crazy thing is, later, these two railroads were fighting continuously for traffic, and later they merged and both became part of the New York Central under the Vanderbilts. Well, let's go back to our Detroit and Pontiac Railroad. It was finally completed in July of 1843, 23 miles to Pontiac. And the money to, and it was supposed, the Michigan Central people saw it as a feeder line for their railway. The Detroit and Pontiac was built cheap. The Detroit terminal was about where Grand Circus Park is. Unfortunately, in Detroit, they didn't have the money. They didn't put down any ballast. They just laid the tracks on the dirt. Now, when it rained, the dirt changed to mud. And as the locomotive came over the rail, it would push the rail down. And you've all done it. What happens when you step into the mud? And remember, there were a lot of horses in the Detroit streets. They were considered to be a public nuisance. The people in Detroit formed a posse and just pulled up all the rails. The railroad hauled them into court, and the court says all they did was remove a public nuisance. So they got Corning and that company to invest in a new line. And it built down Dekinder down to the Brush Street Station, which was, this spot is where the Renaissance Center is now. So that became the depot. Now, Corning people were smart. They provided the funding, but with a separate first mortgage on the rails and on this extension. So in later years, when the railroad went through a series of bankruptcy, they still had to pay the Michigan Central people because they had a separate mortgage on their investment. So with the money from Corning, they built a depot in Detroit, Milwaukee, and then a new guy comes on the scene, Asa Whitney. Asa Whitney was another China trader. He had a lot of money and said, I will build a transcontinental railroad, but it has to start in Detroit and I will do it free. The government's got to give me land, but don't have to give me any money. Government couldn't take a bargain that good. But when that happened, a group of people in Michigan formed the Oakland and Ottawa Railroad, and that was chartered to build from Pontiac to the mouth of the Grand River at Grand Haven. They were able to attract British money because the British had built the Grand Trunk Railroad, the Green Line, and then the Purple Line, the Great Western of Canada, to build across. And when the Great Western of Canada was built, its key to getting to Michigan was to get across, and they needed to build a bridge at the Niagara Falls. And the Niagara Falls Bridge was finally built by John Roebling. Now, just an interesting piece. How do you make the first crossing so you can start building a suspension bridge? How do you get the first line from here to here? They had a contest for boys to fly a kite. And the kite the first kid who got the kite line across was the winner. And they took that string and put a heavier string on, and finally a rope, and finally a steel cable to get the line to start building the bridge. So the line then would be across New York, across Ontario, and then the Michigan Central people who had been involved saw the line coming this way. But now this line, instead of being supportive, was a competitor. And then, of course, the direct line to Milwaukee. Oh, Congress never accepted Asa Whitney's, but they did form, the lines were merged, the Detroit and Pontiac, the Oakland and Ottawa formed the Detroit-Milwaukee Railroad to build. And two people, Henry Walker and C.C. Trowbridge, were sent to England to convince the people, the Great Western people, to finance the Michigan Railroad. And they went to them and said, just let us have access to your roll of stockholders. And we'll meet with your stockholders and try to get them to invest in our Michigan Railroad. They were reluctant, the board was reluctant, but then general manager, C.J. Bridges, tried to convince you should really put money into this line because that will be the feeder from all of that Wisconsin traffic, bringing the grain to Buffalo, to Europe, and we need that grain for the war and for the starving people. Of course, it helped that C.J. Bridges had money invested in the Wisconsin railroads, and that line would help his investments. They convinced the railroad to provide money, and as they got money, they began to build. But it seems that every time they built, they ran into a new scheme. One of the schemes was the free land shares. British people were land poor. And so they attracted British people, saying Michigan gave a land grant to the railroad. And if you buy a share of stock, you get 2.5 acres. So the people bought the stock expecting to get the land. There was one little catch. The Detroit and Milwaukee never got the land because it would not accept Michigan's tax rates. Very quickly, when the Detroit Pontiac was built, they were allowed to build, the tax rate would be 1% of the paid-in capital. The state now demanded 2% of the money that was spent for the railroad. What happened was the Detroit and Pontiac people didn't pay any money in. They did it all with borrowed money. So the people complained to the board of the Great Western. The Great Western had to make them good. But the Detroit and Pontiac people saw the land. They sold the land that they didn't own. Now, the same people who owned the Detroit and Pontiac owned the Port Huron Railroad and got a land grant covering the same land. So those people bought it. So some pieces of land were sold twice, and there was no title for either one of them. Finally, Congress said, we will give you money. We will give you new land so that you can be made full. And just a sidelight, I was going, when my folks sold their house, I went through you remember in the past you used to get a list of every owner on the property, and their house had been owned by the Detroit-Milwaukee Railroad. Maybe it infected me. Anyway, they finally got all the way across the state. Again, dealing with these marshlands. And just outside of Grand Rapids, there was a place called Saddlebag Swamp. They built a shoe fly around the swamp. Why an engineer would designed, laid out, surveyed a railroad across a big swamp. It took them 20 years to fill that in. And one of the things they would do whenever they had obsolete equipment, they would just dump it in the swamp. So there are many, many rail cars in the bottom of that swamp. But a train finally arrived. An Austrian artist painted the first train coming into Grand Haven. The train, the depot in Grand Haven was located on the north side of the river, because they did not want to invest money in a new bridge across the Grand River. It was very inconvenient for the city and for the railroad, particularly during the Civil War, because all of the news for the war came into the telegraph station, which was located in the depot. So you had to come across a river to find out what was happening in the war. The railroad built two boats, the Detroit and the Milwaukee. Unfortunately, they were of a Scottish design where the water does not freeze. They didn't work very well in the winter. So they had to charter other boats. Even after the line was finished, C.J. Bridges was financially manipulating. And one of the things he did was went to a bank in Canada and says, I want to borrow money to buy equipment for this railroad on the Great Western's account. The board of trustees of the board of directors of the Great Western did not know about it. When they got word from the bank in Hamilton that they owed $700,000, they said, we're not going to pay that. We didn't authorize that. And it became a major lawsuit. How far can an employee of a company get your company in debt? It went all the way to the Queen's Court in England, it was an English case. So it went to the Privy Council and to the Queen's Court. And this is, the company doesn't have to pay this. The company cannot be responsible for what, and the bank collapsed. People said they're not going to get back. They ran on the bank and there was a collapse. That was the biggest bank collapse in Canada until caused by our Michigan Railroad until the Great Depression. So this is where the Michigan railroads are in 1860. 3 lines built across the state, one private, the New York Central, which was Michigan Central, later part of the New York Central, which was the strongest, and then the Southern line across the state, which kept changing names. The railroads were important. It led to tremendous economic development in Michigan. It was a bargain for the state. A lot of people got burned on bad investments and chicanery of many kinds. But we did have the railroad. It was important during the time of the Civil War. And for the people, it made their worlds both larger and smaller. It was larger, you could go more places, do more things, buy more products. But it was also smaller. You could do it much quicker. So your world became larger and smaller at the same time. So I ran and talked too long.
Okay, I think we can take questions from the audience. And do I see some hands?
I confused a whole bunch of you.
Is there some from Zoom land? Well, I've got one. Well,
Okay.
okay, here we are.
I was just thinking, I can see where the railroading became synonymous with taking over everybody.
Yeah. Well, they were the first big corporations in Michigan, the first big corporations in America.
Here's a question.
I'm into genealogy. Oh, thank you. I'm into genealogy, and I do have Irish relatives who came over in the early 1840s who worked on the Illinois Central. That went bankrupt, and many of the workers ended up in the Ann Arbor area and worked on the Michigan Central and were never paid for the Illinois Central work, and then took that money and instead of money, took land in Parnell, Michigan, as a alternate to the pay they didn't get in Illinois.
Okay.
nothing to do with anything you had to say. but-
No, but except that you talk about the Irish labor and the struggles that the Irish came over here as very desperate people. Most people who came to America came because they were desperate. They came, and they were terribly exploited by the railroads. Now, when the Detroit and Milwaukee was being built, they got as far as Lowell. And there was something called the Lowell War. The Irish workers had not been paid, and they revolted. As a matter of fact, they grabbed a former a person who had become a major officer in the Civil War, George Innes. They grabbed him and they were going to hang him because they wouldn't get paid. So suddenly the company came up with enough money to pay the workers. Now, in the meantime, while they were holding Innes, the militia company from Grand Rapids was contacted and started marching to Lowell. And they expected to get paid for protecting the railroad. And when the militia got there, they were told, well, we'll give you a pass to ride on the railroad when the railroad is completed. And they were angry because they didn't get any money. But the Grand Rapids newspaper said, why are you complaining? You didn't shoot anybody.
Well, I had one more here.
I worked with a man named John Roebling, who was the grandson of, he was the grandson of the Roebling you mentioned,
Yeah.
who built the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yep.
And he had a big mural in his office of the Brooklyn Bridge. And I'm just curious to learn that he had built some other bridge or built something else that you mentioned.
Well, he built quite a few suspension bridges. There was one across the Delaware River that is still operating. Of course, the Brooklyn Bridge is still operating. Now, the bridge over Niagara was not heavy enough to carry the locomotives. So as the trains became heavier, it became necessary to build a different route. And that train was abandoned. But that was an interesting bridge too, the Niagara Bridge, because it carried people on the bottom and the trains on the top. It was a double-deck bridge, which is done in a number of places. But what's the one thing that we're not allowed to run on a Roebling Bridge? Oh, two things. You could not bring a herd of cattle or a marching band. Because when everybody was in step, it would cause vibrations that would destroy the bridge.
Any other questions from the class audience? Well, I had one. I'm just curious if the Detroit to Pontiac line, it was the first one built in the state.
Yep.
Is that?
No. The first one was Erie and Kalamazoo.
Oh, well, one of the early ones,
One of the earliest. It was the first one chartered.
first chartered.
Yeah.
Is that the same line that runs between Detroit and Pontiac?
Still operates today.
Yeah. I used to take that to work. I live in the Detroit area.
Yeah. And for many years, they ran a commuter service from Brush Street into the Pontiac Depot.
Yeah. And they ended up with the depot down on the river in Detroit River.
Yeah, the Brush Street Depot. That was the name of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's where the Renaissance Center is now. And then it goes up through DeKendry on basically a viaduct through the city.
Mhm, yeah. I never took it that far.
Okay.
I got off in Birmingham.
Oh, okay.
Well.
Thank you for tolerating.
thank
Oh,
you for-
one other thing I should say. Oh, a couple of other railroads I forgot about. Anyway, We're having a big Michigan Railroad History Conference in Ludington on the 6th, 17th of September with a field trip on Ludington railroads the day before. There's brochures if you're interested. I thank you for your time. I thank you for tolerating me. And I talk too much.
Thank you for your time.